Thank you very much for coming out tonight. We always have competing events, so we're very grateful for anyone that shows up to anything. And particularly tonight, those of you who are coming in the context of a holiday, we especially appreciate that. So the Urban Democracy Lab wants to welcome Balakrishnan Rajgopal, a friend of ours, an associate professor of law and development at DUSP at MIT, and founding director of the Program on Human Rights and Justice, and the founder of the Displacement Research and Action Network. He is recognized as a leading participant in the Third World Approaches to International Law network of scholars, one of its founders, and is recognized as a leading global commentator on issues concerning the Global South. He has been a member of the Executive Council and Executive Committee of the American Society of International Law, and is currently on the Asia Advisory Board of Human Rights Watch, the International Advisory Committee of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Center for Human Rights, and the International Rights Advocates. He's also a faculty associate at Harvard Law School's Program on Negotiation, and has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in DC, and the Madras Institute of Development Studies, and the JNU in India as well. Man, you've been a lot of places. This goes on and on. Old and itinerant, apparently. And Institute for Advanced Studies at Hebrew University, and a visiting professor at the Union University for Peace, University of Melbourne Law School, and the Washington College of Law at the American University. Most of all, he is a friend. He's going to present some very, very interesting stuff tonight. Thank you also to the Human Rights Initiative at Gallatin School for helping making this event possible. We're very, very pleased to have you tonight. The things you're going to talk about are of extreme relevance. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that generous and overly long introduction, as usual, Gianpaolo. And it's lovely to come back, and great to see two old friends, Vasuki and Gianpaolo, of course, whose work itself is very inspiring and from which I've learned a great deal over the years, and influenced my way of thinking about some of the things I'm going to talk about today. I would like to just start by saying that the question of human rights, particularly the right to the city, it's actually a kind of a strange thing to talk about, because on the one hand, although it is actually framed in terms of rights, as someone who actually spends a great deal of time in professional human rights circles, the first thing I want to tell you is that professional human rights scholars, and to a lesser extent, practitioners, actually don't pay much attention to this idea at all. It's out there somewhere. It sort of kind of circulates in the realm of urban theory and a bit of sociology, perhaps a little bit of geography, but it's very hard to see that in the what you might call as a professional human rights circles, which even today is large so much from law. And in law, it's hard to find a recognition of that. On the other hand, the urban planning side, which is, oddly enough, I'm kind of situated in both human rights lawyer who's in an urban planning department at MIT. The urban planners, on the other hand, they do engage in some ways with the right to the city. It's an idea that's been talked about over the years in many ways, but they seem largely uninterested in the normative side of the right to the city, as well as in the what you might consider as the professional human rights sites and professional human rights discourses, the locations where they are produced, for example, the UN or the treaty bodies or the the courts or any other such mechanisms where entry points might be available for some of the most frustrating thing about something as vague as right to the city, which is, can we put some teeth on this idea? Can we make it operational in some way? And one might think that, if you look at what the professional human rights people do, you might get some idea, but it's not really typically engaged with by urban planners. So it's an odd thing where the lawyers don't, really, venture much out of the established canon of human rights thinking. So new ideas like right to the city are always either ignored or treated as marginal. And the urban planners don't really engage with the professional human rights folks. So it's like mutual. So just want to start by saying that. The idea that we have to think about city and cities is something that I don't think I need to persuade in one of the greatest cities in the world, standing right here, and in an interdisciplinary department like this. But to repeat the obvious, ad nauseum that comes through professional reports, newspaper coverage, and so on, we are in the throes of an urban revolution, a sweeping population shift from the countryside to the city. The global urban population is growing by 65 million annually, equivalent to adding 7 new Chicagos per year. And of course, we all know that more than half the population lives in towns and cities. Of course, with all the questions about how do you actually define the word urban, let's just put it aside for the moment. It turns out to be, not an easy question to answer. But what I'm more interested in is not simply this urbanization thing, that is the concentration of urban spaces per se, but in what the process of urbanization reveals is about the extreme concentrations of wealth and power. The type of urbanization that's happening. We also know that only 600 cities with 20% of the world's population generate 60% of the world's GDP. Geopolitically, the most interesting thing is that a massive shift is taking place from a world dominated by cities only of the global north to a world that is more evenly or unevenly represented by the rising power of the cities of the south. So the 600 cities in 2000, of course, are not going to be the 600 cities in 2025 or 2040. In particular, hundreds of middle-sized cities from developing countries, particularly rapidly expanding ones like China and India, are competing to get into the top 600. But I think basically what we are seeing is a massive shift, a trajectory of global economic change, and the changing nature of its concentration and the resulting geopolitical implications. And what I'm interested in is what space exists in such a rapidly changing, transformative process for those who are left out of it. The politics of what Partha Chatterjee calls the governed, and the politics of claim making, protests, and yes, rights assertion. And for better or worse, international human rights and the language of human rights has emerged as one of the sites on which these global urban transformations are received, resisted, endorsed, legitimated, delegitimated, and transformed. So I just want to sort of lay out a few of my thoughts about this in the next half an hour or so, and then maybe let's have a conversation about it. Okay, so David Harvey, one who has done as much, if not more, than many other urban theorists about the mainstreaming of the right to the city in recent years. But as those of you who have read his work know, it's not really from the perspective of international human rights. In terms of just where the idea comes from, of course, Harvey was not the originator of the idea. He, of course, as he himself discusses, it's an idea that emerges from the work of sociologists from the 60s, particularly from Henri Lefebvre. And in the mid-60s, in particular, theorizing about right to the city in the context of what he called urban revolution, and seeing the language of the right to the city not so much as a bourgeois set of rights, but as a language of total transformation of society and of the self in many ways. Of course, those of us who come from the human rights field know that he was writing about rights during a time when international human rights movement was itself not yet quite born. There were international professional vocabularies of human rights. Sites like the UN where human rights instruments and laws were being developed, but he was not writing by borrowing the idea from the international sphere, but rather borrowing the idea from the language of popular social movements, including those who were anti-colonial in the peculiar situation of the student protests of 1968, and then the anti-colonial protests in which France found itself in the 1960s. Now, what did he mean by the right to the city? Well, he, in my reading, has two components, emphasizes two components of the right to the city: the right to participation and the right to what he calls habitation. The right to participate for him is not a thin liberal concept of participation, as we might say, for example, like participation in the process of decision making, like notice and comment process, for example, in administrative law. But it's a deeper notion of making and remaking the city, city as an oeuvre, a work in which, as he says, all citizens participate. We'll come to what that means exactly in the context of some specific examples, particularly from countries like Brazil, where, as Gianpaolo knows more than anyone else in this room, the attempt to give operational content to the right to the city has been experimented more actively than other countries in some ways, although with very mixed results, one might add. The second component that he emphasizes, the right to habitation, has two subcomponents. The first is a right to difference, which is a commitment to a radical plurality of cities, a rebellion against sameness, which seems kind of an odd thing to say at a time when all cities are aspiring in some ways to sameness, about, for example, under the notion of world-class cities. And the second subcomponent of the right to habitation is the right to inhabit, which he calls a right to housing. Now, my own reading of his notion of the right to housing is not that he talks about housing as a commodity, far from it, that is not a property right, including, of course, the right to exclude, but that the right to housing is itself has a creationist kind of dimension to it, a self-productive element, somewhat similar to the way in which John Turner, the planning theorist, actually wrote about how poor people actually provide housing for themselves in the 1970s. Somewhat similar to that. I would suggest that Lefebvre was actually ahead of his time, even though international human rights law and notions such as economic and social rights, which actually began to legitimate right to housing, for example, although in a much more narrow way than what he meant by the right to housing. As I said, the right to housing in international human rights law is currently articulated more in the sense of a commodity, a good that can be provided, and the absence of it in turn implies an obligation on the part of the state or other actors to provide that particular good or commodity. Lefebvre was suggesting something else. But I do think that what he was talking about comes at a very opportune time. The reason why, although professional human rights lawyers have ignored the right to the city by and large, in fact, it has a lot of resonance among social movements, urban planners, small entrepreneurs, squatters, street vendors, migrants, you name it, you've got a lot of resonance there in both rich countries of the North as well as in developing countries. And just briefly, we have to understand why at this current moment this is so, this idea has become resonant. The idea of the city and the idea that, for most people who are marginalized, they don't find a space and a place in what we call cities in today's world. And if you oh, that's a dude, by the way. So, all right. So, growth of human rights. I'll come to that. If you look at, for example, some recent work that I did, looking at different cities, I'll just mention 2 or 3 here. Chennai in India, Kuala Lumpur, and Sao Paulo in Brazil. What's actually going on is actually a concrete illustration of what I said earlier, that the giant global transformation that is happening is really, raising fundamental questions about the patterns of exclusion that have emerged to keep the large social majorities out of, any contention for equality, and essentially confining them to subsistence and to the fringes, what many writers have begun to call as the process of creation of some kind of an apartheid process in today's cities, where poor people are increasingly pushed to the periphery and are subject to living in areas which have greater risks in every possible way. And the process of creating this is not an exception to the rule of creation of cities. It's a very structure of the way in which today's cities actually depend on, their survival. David Harvey, of course, uses the language of surplus and capturing the surplus from a Marxist theory point of view to explain that. But whether you subscribe to that or not, it's undoubtedly clear that this process is ongoing. This is Chennai, for example, which had a once-in-a-100-year flood in 2015. And, a lot of the people who got displaced were people who are already living in very precarious conditions along Chennai's waterways, which had been overbuilt completely, in complete, violation of planning regulations and master plans, which of course exist only on paper. And then to find that the moment the water became a risk to them, the government's first response was to actually use that opportunity to purge them from the meager city spaces that they had actually been occupying for a while, and to say, oh, for your own safety, we're going to move you out 40 kilometers away. And these are some of the colonies which they were moved into during the last flood, by the way. And this flood came along, and you see what that looks like. Okay. Okay. Okay, there you go. Yeah, no, I'm pressing the right one, or. Oh, back. Okay. There you go. Okay, there you go. So a second example is from Malaysia, where me and some of my students were actually doing work last year, looking at what you might only call as an urban village. If you're familiar with the concept of urban villages in China, these are, in the middle of vast commercial and, property development for housing and so on, infrastructure that is world-class, gleaming towers, the Petronas towers, and so on. There are pockets of what you might call as traditional housing, occupied typically by local Malay residents with the combination of immigrant populations, typically from neighboring countries like Indonesia, usually renters, highly insecure. And these parcels are very large number in a city like Kuala Lumpur, for example, and they're faced with the constant threat of being excluded and evicted and being replaced by more world-class infrastructure and housing and commercial property. So this is a shot from inside the Kampong Baru, which is the urban village from which we actually looked at the Petronas Towers at the back. You can see, thanks to Tom Cruise, we all know what they look like. So, this is another shot. Okay, so we'll come to the city statute in a moment. But what we see, we also did some similar work in my team looking at the process of systematic exclusion in a city like Delhi, for example, where it's frightening how much it has been a structural feature of Delhi's urban transformation in the last 15 years that poor people have been systematically purged really to the periphery, often in the name of providing housing for them through resettlement programs. What I want to say is that this process of systematic exclusion and the process of what I said earlier, the process that is similar to the creation of an apartheid-like regime, is in fact the spatial dimension of today's great urban and therefore, geopolitical transformation. There is a spatial dimension to it, and it's very important to understand the spatial dimension because the centrality, the resonance of the idea of right to the city comes partly from its counter hegemonic role as yet another spatial claim. It's a spatial claim by people who have been excluded to say, wait a minute, the only spatial claim that matters is not only your claim, but what you think is the right way to organize a city, but our spatial claims matter too. And they're trying to sort of position their spatial claims within the language of rights. And I think that that's actually a very important thing to sort of understand because there are other similarities within the human rights regime for other spatial claims that actually went against what you might call as hegemonic spatial claims, say of colonialism, of empire, and then sort of try to checkmate those claims by coming up with their own spatial claims. In particular, I have in mind the idea of the right to self-determination as a spatial claim, for example, which coalesced around the idea of the nation state, but there is no need why it had to sort of settle around the borders of the nation state. But I think in human rights theory, there is a relative inattention to this particular aspect of the rise of new spatial claims that have become increasingly important. In some ways, in the longer version of my paper, I compare that to a kind of an assertion similar to the Charter of the Forest, the second part of Magna Carta, which emphasizes the protection of the rights in common, and the idea of the commoners' rights as having priority over what it called commodity relations, literally, of valuing things for their own sake, as the document put it. That's actually a Marxist critique in many ways. And I want to actually say that there is a rapid professionalization of the idea of right to the city from its vague articulation by Henri Lefebvre in the 1960s with all of its components. And I'll just mention a few examples of the professional articulation of the right to the city, which will bring us to the city statute, and then express a few views about whether it's a good idea or not such a great idea that the right to the city movement, is perhaps from its own limited engagement finding intersection with the professional human rights language and professional human rights vocabulary. There are number of different ways in which right to the city has been professionalized or elevated as a normative claim through particular instruments or particular moments during the last 25 years, and I'll just mention a few. The idea of, first of all, the emergence of the city as a focal point of human rights was the first sort of gradual move towards elevation of the right to the city. I'm thinking of, for example, the European Conference of Cities for Human Rights, which was created in October 1998 in Barcelona, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The network of cities that was established in Barcelona became quite large and became essentially a number of cities had risen to over 230 by the time a second charter was signed, the European Charter for the Safeguarding of Human Rights in the City, which was adopted in 2000 by more than 200 European cities. Also coinciding at the same moment, more or less, was a treaty for the democratic, equitable, and sustainable cities, towns, and villages approved at the Rio World Conference on the Environment. UNESCO, the UN body in charge of economic and social and cultural rights, has attempted to organize a European coalition of cities against racism. But the main thrust behind the right to the city has actually come from Latin America, particularly from Brazil. In fact, many Brazilian friends that I know who are involved in the articulation of the right to the city kind of think of it as their baby. You know, they have this ownership towards this idea. When Brazil adopted the statute of the city, for example, our city statute in 2001, it was truly quite a significant way to sort of move away from a more vague political articulation of a claim or a cry and a demand, as Henri Lefebvre actually described right to the city, to making it something more concrete, to give it more specific dimensions. This law, for example, covered aspects such as democratic participation through budgeting, for example, assuring basic rights of all the inhabitants of the city, which went beyond the constitutional protections which are confined more to citizens. Crucially, giving some operational content to this Latin American notion that property and the city itself have social functions, that property is not only an economic institution, that it has social functions. And this was a notion, of course, that had been inserted into the Brazilian constitution in the 1980s. But the city statute certainly made it more concrete through the recognition of particular legal devices. For example, through increasing recognition of adverse possession. So made it more easy for groups who are actually, looking for ways to legitimate their spatial claims by pointing to, legal rights from private law, such as adverse possession. And of course, additional set of rights, including housing rights, and procedural innovations such as neighborhood impact studies that actually sort of get the neighborhood involved in the self-governance of the type of community in the neighborhood and therefore the city that they want to build. Something similar to what, Lefebvre actually calls for, when he talks about right to participation, as a deep process. It's not a procedural thin right, but a deep right. And many NGOs like, the Brazilian NGO FACI actually built on this and proposed the Charter for Human Rights in the cities at the Brazilian Conference for Human Rights in 2001. During the first administration of President Lula, a Ministry of Cities was established, which in turn absorbed many of the housing rights advocates into the administration, attempting to give concreteness and specificity and crucially budgetary and governmental framework to the policies that might have to be developed based on the idea of the ideas contained in the statute of the city. The World Social Forums, which was supported by Brazil in the 2000s, actually also had a crucial role to play, particularly by pushing for the World Charter on the Right to the City, adopted at the World Urban Forum in Barcelona, and the Americas Social Forum in Quito in 2004. Since then, there have been a number of cities that have actually built on the Brazilian example to try to, incorporate right to the city as a framework for urban legislation. In most cases, of course, the result of that, I will not go into a full assessment of what they've added up to, but they've remained mostly mixed, stories with very mixed record. But I'm thinking of stories such as the Montreal City Charter in 2006. Mexico City adopted a charter on the right to the city in 2010. And what one begins to see is that roughly from the late 90s onwards to roughly in the first decade of the 2000s, the right to the city as a notion really became much more central to the political and mobilizational strategies of a diverse range of urban social movements and progressive social actors, who in turn began to sort of increasingly rely on the idea that we have to translate these vague ideas into something concrete by developing urban legislation, relying on the Brazilian example, and developing policy instruments to try to achieve that. And you can already see that this is a fascinating development. So the question is, what does it all add up to? And my take, of course, as somebody who wears a human rights hat, is what do I think this adds up to from the perspective of the professional vocabularies and the professional discourses of international human rights. What is, as I said, first, the promise of the right to the city as a human right? What does it add that we don't have? Is it needed? And some of the perils of right to the city as a human rights concept, not simply a mobilizational idea, a political idea, in a Henry Lefebvrean sense, but something that is more fundamental. So I'll just offer a few speculations about that, and then we'll open it up. So first, from the perspective of what the promise of the right to the city is as a human right. The first thing that struck me when I looked at the right to the city more closely was how it looks like we are coming back to, in some ways, a notion of a collective right or a solidarity right paradigm, which used to be much more dominant and prevalent in the 1970s in the human rights field, such as the right to peace, the right to self-determination, and the right to development. A right to development was one of the crucial, more controversial rights that were developed as part of the professional human rights vocabulary, and which still continues to exercise a great deal of political influence in the professional human rights circles, particularly in interstate politics, at the UN system, for example. But these ideas were all united by many common elements, which are the right to the city shares, that it is not an individual right. It is actually a notion, it's a collective right. It is not a right to a good, but it is instead a right that attempts at transforming something structural. It is actually it is a right that has a spatial element to it, such as the right to self-determination, which in turn raises a question of who is exactly the self and what exactly are you, how are you going to determine the boundaries of the self around which you're going to, exercise your determination. These notions all are there, these dilemmas, which are never, by the way, completely resolved with the earlier collective rights, and were subject of great deal of disagreement and controversy, continue to be there at the heart of the right to the city. But the key thing is that there is a commitment to a notion of solidarity, that we must act together because our problems are common, and we have to move to the language of the common. And you see that, for example, in diverse range of city-level experiments that articulate the right to the city. You see that in the Montreal Charter, for example, which starts by saying, oh, the traditional conception of rights, by which I mean the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, is too individualistic, and so on and so forth. So, and then you look at the Brazilian law, which actually imposes, the 2001 law, it imposes a duty of solidarity. As to how exactly you give meaning to something like that is a different question. But there are many cities like in Europe, for example, Professor Sheila Foster, who teaches at in New York here, has written about the experiments in cities like Bologna in Italy, where they have actually attempted to come up with notions such as co-city, collective rights that actually seek to give concrete shape to the idea of acting together in common, solving problems together. What actually this actually tells us is that the right to the city is actually a program right or a framework right, rather than a single right to a single thing, and which in turn might be composed of many different rights. But the as I will say later in a moment, I think the usefulness of the right to the city as a kind of a counter-hegemonic right may be lost if we push too far in this direction and then conclude that the right to the city is simply a catalog of other pre-existing rights. So we have to be careful with that. The political wind behind the right to the city as an idea comes from many different directions, and you see different manifestations of it. I'll just mention a few from both examples from here in the United States and also from India. By and large, the push towards the articulation of the right to the city has come from a rapid rise in the intensity and the mobilizational energy of social movements. National fronts, for example, on housing, similar to the ones that actually contributed to the formation of the Ministry of Cities under Lula's administration in the early 2000s, have actually made a significant impact on the articulation of housing policy in cities like Delhi, for example, by engaging with state-level agencies to push for policies such as commitment to no evictions where poor people live, and to commit themselves to in situ improvement where poor people live, rather than trying to say that, well, for your own safety, we have to actually move you out to another location 40 kilometers away, which is the process that actually ended up producing the kind of the spatial segregation, the apartheid-like features of today's cities, as I said. But these movements don't exist in a vacuum. If you look at a movement like the housing movement in India, for example, it has really benefited from an ecosystem of other movements, being influenced by other movements in terms of their ability to, borrow ideas from each other, their ability to collectively act together for pushing for specific policies, to collectively mobilize when fundamental issues are at stake. This is a feature that you begin to increasingly see in many countries. In the United States, for example, you begin to see that in the rise of what were initially a few isolated groups working on issues like housing, but now increasingly being articulated in terms of a right to the city. There is a right to the city, coalition in the United States that is it's actually based out of New York, and it has many city-level chapters. For example, they take different names. And I'll just mention the one in Boston, for example. This is just an image of a similar process of, the creation of the apartheid process from Brazil. And how in countries like Brazil, the substantive rights that were actually created under laws like the 2001 City Statute have been used actively by many movements, which built on previous experience in occupying land and claiming rights by rural movements such as the MST. MST is the movement of the landless poor. This is in one of the southern Brazilian states, where when I was there, this community had just moved there, and the previous day, they had just been, they had occupied this land, and I arrived the next day. and I was in the middle of this particular community. So if you take, for example, the Right to Remain coalition, for example, in Boston, this is actually a fairly recent phenomenon in the last 5-6 years, which has actually combined a number of different elements, including traditional critiques of gentrification, for example, in Boston, which has one of the highest rising prices, real estate, land and rental prices in the United States. And a search for strategies, including some legal or administrative strategies to prevent or reduce the number and the incidences of eviction. For example, the Boston Coalition has tried to push for an ordinance at the city level called the Just Cause Ordinance, essentially trying to show that, impose a requirement that there must be a requirement to show just cause before eviction is actually approved, and has gradually emerged to articulate different elements of the right to the city, including the right to participate. So Boston's going through its first master planning process in 40 years now, and this Right to Remain coalition has fast emerged as a focal point of a broader set of demands about structural problems in the growth of a city like Boston that has systematically managed to exclude the working class, the minorities, and the poor over several decades, and totally inadequate responses in terms of affordable housing or other strategies that has not quite leveled the playing field as much as even the most progressive and the most optimistic people actually expected. So they are actually pushing for different elements of the shell. I don't want to say it's a Brazilian model, but the fact of the matter is that Brazil has actually had the maximum impact on right to the city. But many of the elements that when I hear that are being mentioned in the conversations and the mobilizational strategies of these movements in Boston, it reminds me so much of what I've heard and seen in a country like Brazil over the years. Of course, this push for articulating a set of rights which are more collective or communal in nature, which moves away from individual rights, has, of course, some previous examples. The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is a community-led corporation that was actually granted eminent domain power by the city of Boston many, many years ago. This is many years before the emergence of the right to the city as an idea, which in turn used the eminent domain power to assemble land parcels to engage in more, responsible redevelopment strategies. And the most interesting part of this is that when they declared a list of community rights. If you go through some of these rights, it's quite interesting how much resonance is there between what they're talking about and what we actually now consider to be the core elements of, right to the city, drawn from a Henry Lefebvrean kind of concept. So, for example, the right to control the development of neighborhood land, the right to shape the development of all plans. It actually goes beyond, in fact, in some ways, the articulation of the key elements of the right to the city in a Lefebvrean way. So there's long list of rights, actually. Now, what might be? It sounds like actually in many ways, this is the moment for right to the city, and that we should be welcoming it. And what could actually be wrong, or what could be some of the downsides of, right to the city getting more professionalized, more and more charters, city charters, global charters, attempts by whether NGOs or city level governments or others to give more concreteness and specificity to the idea of right to the city, relying on the Brazilian model and so on. What could be wrong with that? I really don't think that, we don't have a way of predicting whether it might actually turn out to be a brief moment that will pass. And this would be one of those ideas that were quite popular, like right to peace in the 1970s, but that never really found purchase on the ground. There's no traction really ultimately, and kind of dissipated slowly. But perhaps not. But my own sort of set of remarks, last remarks, is actually about what might be some of the perils of the right to the city as a professional human right. And I'll just mention a few. One of my major concerns is that as we professionalize the right to the city more and make it more and more like a professional list of human rights, we might actually end up reducing it to mean either a right to government programs or a right to property. And in either case, I'm worried about the problem of excessive legalization. What legalization might do to what is otherwise a more rebellious, perhaps more open-ended, notion, which is capable of being deployed in specific ways, and particularly of relating to the concrete struggles of specific communities. Whether it's possible to retain that kind of open-endedness and malleability, which are crucial for social mobilization, as opposed to excessive concreteness. In the field of economic and social rights in particular, there has been a long tendency to reduce economic and social rights to mean right to government programs. In the late 70s, famously, a famous human rights scholar wrote an article saying a right to housing is nothing but a right to government programs. If you look at many other judgments of courts that have actually come out since then, even progressive judgments from South African, constitutional court, which has been lauded as a pioneer in economic and social rights jurisprudence. I won't go into the list of all the cases, but if you look at many of the list of cases, so many of them have revolved around precisely this issue. Whether a right to health, for example, or a right to housing actually means a right to government programs. And in some cases, the courts have come dangerously close to affirming, yes, that's pretty much what it means. And that would be, I think, a serious mistake, because it's like defanging, essentially, the idea of right to the city, which retains a kind of if not a revolutionary, but a destabilizing potential because of its spatial claim, because of its ability to serve as a bridge between diverse constituencies, because of its collective nature, and so on. It actually retains an ability to act as a vehicle for a variety of forms of collective action, including by social movements. And I worry that that could be lost. The other thing that I worry about is the danger that comes whenever you professionalize human rights, that you end up relying on the courts and the judiciary quite a lot for the final word. They are the ones who are going to interpret it. And in the end, that is always a, shall we say, double-edged sword. Sometimes you might actually find that it's a strategically useful thing to do, but very often, as I've certainly learned in the case of the country where I come from, India, where resort to courts and court judgments are a big part of giving shape to and concreteness to the language of rights. Courts can be very fickle partners, and courts can be ideologically opposed to the sort of broad-based changes that collective claims by social movements often imply. In a famous case called the Almitra Patel case, I'll just mention that as an example of blatant judicial bias. A judge went so far as to say that to recognize any rights to the urban poor who have no property is like rewarding pickpockets. Literally, the quote from the judgment. I do worry about the extent to which judges and the judicial and the legal class can be allies in broad-based transformative strategies of social movements, which often drive the process of using and relying on the notion of the right to the city. This peril, I don't want to say that this is somehow unique to the right to the city idea. This peril is inherent in the rights language and the techniques of adjudication itself in terms of any human right. But I'm not sure that the proponents of the right to the city idea, particularly who seek to professionalize and especially those who try to create more city-based charters, like the Mexico City one, for example, are sufficiently aware of the downsides in some ways, and whether they take enough steps to retain struggle and politics at the heart of attempt to realize the right to the city. I'm not so sure that it's actually happening. I mean, essentially the idea being that the rights language is so rooted in law, especially at this stage now, because of the legalization of the notion of rights over the last 30 years, which in some ways is a success, but it's also a peril. The rights language is so rooted in law, which is the language of official state politics, that that unless ordinary people happen to have a really democratic and sympathetic government, where social movements may have interpenetrating relations with the state, as was the case in Brazil briefly for some years, but no longer the case, the rights language may itself end up as an exclusionary device. And that's a concern that I and many of us, Vasuki shares powerfully that concern too. So let me conclude by just paraphrasing David Harvey and just say this, that a step towards unifying the disparate social movement struggles around the world, which have emerged in the context of this massive global urban transformation, which signifies a fundamental shift in geopolitical relations around the world. That a step towards unifying these movements that have emerged in the context of these changes is to adopt the right to the city as a working political ideal and a mobilizational tool, democratizing that right, enforcing it through the politics of intersection with the state at local or regional levels, as was briefly the case in Brazil, while also being able to leverage the transnational political space that the articulation of a language of rights or international human rights that the right to the city affords is very imperative for the marginalized and the socially dispossessed of the world to organize a sufficient response to the huge global transformations that are underway. So I'll just stop there, and thank you very much. Yep, if you want.
Okay, is it on? Okay. I was just wondering, because a lot of the examples you gave were in regards to people who were living in urban spaces and then were being relocated against their will. And I was just wondering if at all this right to the city is contingent on property ownership, or at least your residence in a property, and if it isn't, in what way could the right to the city as a human right be used to advocate for homeless populations that also occupy urban spaces?
Right. No, absolutely. Well, I think that's actually a great question. In fact, many of the population, the examples that I was giving where they're occupying a space, it's not the same thing as saying that they have property rights over them. The examples, for example, in the Chennai example, as well as the urban village from Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, actually are of communities that actually do not have formal property rights. In fact, that's part of the issue. In KL, for example, the lands that on which the residents live on in Kampong Baru, that particular urban village, actually do not belong to the residents. They actually don't belong to the city either. So it's a very odd situation. There we found when we did research that in fact it belongs to the Sultan of Johor, who's the kind of the monarch. And it was a royal grant that had been given before Malaysian constitution was adopted. And one reason why, in fact, this particular urban village has lasted longer than other villages because the city officials don't quite know how to overcome the legal barrier of because it's not their land. But in other cases where the land is in fact the city land, which it often is, then it's simply a question of dealing with the urban village residents as a bunch of squatters. They have no property rights at all. So the question of property claim is at the root of it, although the assertion by this community is not to a right to property. They don't quite assert that they have to be issued title deeds or that they should be given equivalent property elsewhere. But they claim that space where, as in some strands of property theory, they've put down roots in the community. That's where they've lived. That's where their cultural life has been constructed, right? That's where they've come together as a community, and they want to live there, not elsewhere. It's not about getting another, apartment that is of the same square footage. It's not about that, and it becomes a very, interesting issue because of that. Because the real question, when we participated in a redevelopment plan that for this community that the city hall had prepared, it looks so fancy, all visual projections, beautifully done, but all high-rise buildings, by the way. They'll all get apartments on the 24th floor, etc. And one of the questions that the residents was asking was, well, where would we meet? There is no meeting space for them. And these are people who, many of them come from traditional Malay communities. They like to sit around on charpoys, in the evening and have tea. That's the social relations and the patterns of social interaction are what makes them human of who they are. And they don't want to give that up for an apartment on the 24th floor. Although, in fact, monetarily, that's going to be of more value.
So just to follow up then, because again, all the examples we're using are in largely, not exclusively, but they seem to be in more developing communities and or developing regions of nations. So do you think that these applications of the right to the city as a human right can be established in places like New York City? I mean, I know we got the example from Boston, but not just in terms of gentrification and people opposed to higher rents, but the really marginalized populations that exist here as well. Do you think that this type of human right can be applicable to them or can have a real application rather than just an ideological one?
Well, I think that's essentially the question. The question is, what do we want out of this notion of right to the city? If you want it as a political mobilizational tool, it's one thing. But if you want it to actually deliver particular results, then you're getting to the whole question of how do you give it concreteness, which then gets into the whole question of, well, are you going to draft a New York charter on the right to the city? And if so, what elements should there be? Should you look at the Brazilian model and so on? And my own view, as I express, is that, it's got its pluses and minuses. And we have to be very careful in over-institutionalizing this idea of the right to the city, because it might lose the very reason, the potential why it actually became a powerful ideal for collective action and mobilization in that particular moment in history, which was in the 90s, the moment of high globalization, to put it that way, and the kind of the decade when previous decades of social exclusion are beginning to sort of come together in a very specific and concrete form. In the 90s, it was becoming obvious that the rich were getting really rich and the social patterns were achieving a form of social exclusion, which ended up producing an explosion of social revolt from below. By the late 90s, it was a very robust anti-globalization movement around the world. And it didn't come out of nowhere.
Hi. So I had a question about your worry about institutionalization. Since you're a person who actually has done a lot with international human rights institutions and treaty bodies and the UN and so on, and has invested in that presumably as a space that you think has some political yield or political potential. And so the right to the city, I mean, I wonder whether how in your worry about it, whether it's that whether the work it does is purely aesthetic in some sense, that it stays outside institutions as a political disruption or an idea of political disruption, and the worry about co-optation and institutionalization and mainstreaming means that that these are actually, it does a different kind of work. And so I wonder whether you could speak a little bit to different kinds of registers of the political, which seem to be suggested by your worry. So.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's not only the right to the city, right? In fact, it's part of the rights claiming in when it comes to even other human rights that are supposedly more well established. You know, if you take, for example, the notion of the indigenous rights, they assume different forms, and the claims that they actually have developed over the years range from certain forms of cultural rights, which were seen as, for example, so extreme, and certainly not capable of being articulated in an institutional way, to land claims, for example, articulating assertions over collective, rights over use rights over land, not quite property rights, but forms of collective access rights, for example, that in turn have given rise to a range of legal instruments, which, of course, international lawyers we call soft law instruments. The soft law instruments don't have quite the binding force of treaties, for example, but they nevertheless have a certain political and normative, force and legitimacy, which in turn has a kind of a role in the mobilizational strategies of movements on the ground. They rely on the very, the legal or the quasi-legal or the soft law instruments that they actually manage to insert into particular sites to then develop alternative vocabularies and strategies of politics. So a concrete example from outside of right to the city would be, the whole emergence of declaration on the rights of peasants, farmers, which has become a major global issue now, thanks to the mobilization of groups such as Via Campesina, which is actually powerfully articulated. There has to be a global charter on the rights of peasants, and in fact, that is a notion that is being inserted into formal human rights bodies such as the UN Human Rights Council, to see whether the states could all agree that there should be a declaration on the rights of peasants. Now, would it have any binding force? No. But the collective, the political register, as you call it, of articulating something such as a declaration on the rights of peasants is not the traditional one of, say, adopting a treaty, in which case you're looking to courts to have the treaty rights enforced. So you're certainly looking to the legislature to pass a law to enforce the obligations the state has taken on when the state becomes a binding, shows a binding legal commitment to a treaty, and then you're going to rely on a court to interpret what the particular provisions mean in specific contexts. But I don't see that as part of the strategies of groups like Via Campesina pushing for a declaration on the rights of peasants. So something like the right to the city, when it was adopted, for example, in the number of charters that I mentioned, they were not actually legally binding treaties, but they were spaces for legitimating certain spatial claims. And which is, I think, I don't see any problem with that. I think it's actually an essential part of what we think of as human rights work. There are variety of degrees of normative concreteness through which the language of rights actually registers itself. And they all have different resonances among different users of that particular language. So, I mean, the way I see the right to the city is that the right to the city as a notion which is similar in that way to a more loosely organized but highly appealing, set of ideals that legitimated the spatial claims of the previously marginalized, I think is terribly important. I think the danger comes when right to the city is taken to its logical normative extreme, to its normative conclusion, and people begin to talk about how to actually operationalize and how to create a program around the implementation of the right to the city. And that, may or may not go well. Brazil, which had the most advantageous circumstances for pulling that off, found that even they couldn't do it, effectively. Perhaps there is some other place where it might happen, but until that happens, we don't have a good example.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, and I feel like you actually there's a paradox at the bottom of your talk that I want to ask you about, but I wanted to say that you soft pedaled on Brazil. I think there's a moment of such an intense moment of self-criticism among Brazilian urban activists now, who realize that the judiciary turned out to have been arbitrary, like no one had expected, and the political institutions themselves were much more fragile, and political parties and movement interfaces with the state were more polluting than they thought. And so now the right to the city Brazil folks who are communicating internationally to the right to the city people are issuing this warning, right? So there's an interesting discussion happening in the US among the right to the city organizations, which is how to exist and how to be while preserving some of that autonomy, right? How to kind of perform this disruptive function, but yet have the capacity. So right to the city's 68 organizations is a very complex operation with no funding, right? So going without foundation funding, going without political party connections and all this stuff. So the question they're facing, which, gets to this paradox, is how to continue to be while rejecting institutionalization.
Right. I was going to leave to you about what the real Brazilian reaction is, not to occupy that space, because you're going to be, I know, far more informed than I am on this, and certainly much more critical than I am on this. But what I see interestingly among Brazilian activists is this. When I go to Brazil and talk to scholars and activists on the ground, they are very critical of what their experience has been in the last 15, 20 years. But when they occupy transnational spaces, for example, there is a global right to the city platform, that in fact the Brazilian academics and scholars are the ones who are, instrumental in creating. I happen to be on it also, and we have all these periodic meetings. And it's interesting that the transnational level, it's defended as an ideal. But again, it raises the question of, the same question came up when right to development was at its zenith. Similar question: how do you operationalize? What does it mean in reality? What is use is it of people on the ground, and how do you find that sweet spot where you have that intersection with institutionalization, but not so much that you are being bought off, and in fact you're doing development in the same discredited way. Can you do development in some other way? And what I see is that something similar happening in the case of right to the city, where the ideal of the right to development would be defended as a macro right that actually provides a legitimating space for not today's half-baked, failed schemes about how to bring about a new vision of development, but some other future thing that might emerge, which might actually find that space as the only one of maybe a few spaces through which it can legitimate itself. And sometimes I feel like the right to the city folks are strong defenders of the right to the city as an ideal at the transnational because of this reason. They don't want to give up on it yet. It's one of those alternative notions out there. Just hang on to it. But it doesn't have as much resonance among states or the level of state-to-state human rights discourse. Countries are, the Human Rights Council is yet to pass a single resolution on the right to the city, including nothing's proposed by Brazil, which to me is astonishing that Brazil would not have put forward a resolution. I wonder why you think Brazil hasn't done that, but it's not seen as part of Brazil's foreign policy strategy. Brazil has not pushed, even during the Lula government, seen its diplomacy in terms of promoting its unique sort of approach to, for example, urban governance or through cities or through democratic participation or participatory budgeting. None of that became such a strong part of Brazilian sort of foreign policy. To the extent that those experiments have traveled, it's because of other channels, right?
Thank you. So I wanted to ask a question about the concept of sameness, because this seemed to be a prevailing concern. What I understand is that poverty is operationalized in various ways. And the job of the urban planner or the urban designer is to focus on a building or a certain lot or maybe a couple of lots to fit into a space. And I was curiously thinking during your presentation, how can we operationalize solutions through the Sustainable Development Goals? And then would that sameness really disappear and instead uplift the various cultural perceptions that are often marginalized? And so there would be a turn of events happening in our civilization. Just want to put that forward. Thank you.
Very broad question. First of all, in our department at least, we tried very hard to teach people that urban planning and urban design is not about lots. It's about the city. We got to think beyond the lot. That's what architects do. You think about the lot if you're an architect, but then if you want to go do something about urban problems, you got to think beyond the lot. The SDG question that you mentioned is very interesting because, actually in some ways, the reorientation of the Millennium Development Goals to become Sustainable Development Goals as a global concept. Millennium Development Goals were for targeted only at developing countries. SDGs are about the North and the South or the entire planet, which in turn raises an interesting question of how will that translate into, engagement with other pre-existing professional discourses. For example, planning, urban planning, of law, of other forms of expert knowledges. I have to say that this conversation is just beginning. And I think it's a great opportunity to try to use the right to the city as a framework to actually begin some of the concrete ways in which, maybe a framework that actually takes SDGs more seriously can actually be used to promote or push for changes in, say, city master planning process. Either the process of master planning, as well as the particular normative goals against which master planning is evaluated in terms of whether it's actually good master planning or not. Last year, I organized a panel at MIT on looking at Boston master planning and SDGs, specifically to ask this question. So don't think, folks, that these are apples and oranges. They can be looked at together, right? If we take SDGs seriously, what would Boston look like? What would Boston master planning look like? And it actually resonated quite a bit with a lot of the groups. They're not quite sure what to do with the framework itself, though. But the idea that there are global benchmarks which you can actually rely on in order to develop critiques of, for example, some established practices of social exclusion that you cannot find a vocabulary for using traditional languages, for example, in American democracy and American law, it's actually a liberating thought. Hey, come on, we can maybe do something else here, right? And I do think that in doing that, perhaps there is more of a chance for cultivating many zones of difference in the Lefebvrean way to rebel against the sameness that is imposed on city after city and space after space. You know, perhaps it's this framework that could give us one more way in which we can concretely express the differences. So I remain quite optimistic about this.
Since we were talking about urban planning, I wonder what you see the conversation being between Susan Feinstein's concept of the just city and the right to the city. Just piggybacking off this last question.
Yeah. Oh boy. Okay. I think it's Feinstein's concept. I mean, the idea that of a city as a normative ideal is not new. Cities are always normative. The question is, you know, whether you ground it in some notion of justice, and if so, what form of justice is actually appropriate, or what ideals of justice are appropriate in the kind of global situation in which we find ourselves. My own reading of Susan Feinstein's work in her book, The Just City, is that she doesn't quite engage with the right to the city in a significant way. Not through other writings in a major way as well. And to the extent that there is an engagement with the right to the city, it's certainly not engaged with the transnational or international dimensions or the cross-national learning dimensions that come if you look at the Brazilian group's influence on the Mexican groups, which in turn develop their notions when they developed their 2010 charter on the right to the city. You don't quite get that dynamic, you know. I do think that it's. I mean, this is a much larger conversation, but I do think that it's highly problematic to try to ground, for example, spatial claims in a singular notion of justice, because it's so contested. The notion of a right, on the other hand, is by its nature much more subjective and not sort of, it's not something that you have to put on a pedestal and then sort of enshrine it as the framework against which all the other rights claims will in turn be judged. That's actually part of the constraining nature of a broad sort of idea such as justice. So I'm not sure how it will work out, or maybe there are notions of justice or theories that might be able to deal with this discomfort of mine. But I'm much more comfortable having more subjectivity, because it just creates more unpredictability and more variation and maybe more difference. That's actually a better thing to do. It's less capable of being controlled, for one thing.
Hi, I want to ask a more concrete question about financing. Financing kind of the maintenance or the support of the right to the cities, because I was reading through the what they proposed in Boston, and then it seems to me a lot of the notions of the right to the cities are kind of maintain or improve the life quality in certain communities without displacing the people, the original dwellers in the community. Yeah. So obviously, if it's through public government programs, it's the financing will come from the public sector. I'm just curious, in the previous cases you did, was there any very innovative ways to finance these kind of right to the city from the public sector or from the community itself? That's worth mentioning.
Right, which is a great question. In fact, one of the one of the, sort of the sense of disillusionment that people already have about other city-based charters like Montreal. In Mexico City, for example, people find it hard to remember that they adopted a 2010 charter, partly because of some of the practical difficulties of, financing and implementation, lack of follow-up, rules, lack of engagement with administrative structures, there are, of course, several micro examples of communities, for example, organizing community-based financing strategies, for example, through community land trusts or other forms of land-based financing strategies to come up with ways of overcoming the financing bottleneck. The DSNI is a good example. The example from Boston that predates the Right to the City movement. DSNI actually used, land community land trust to actually, engage in what you might call as urban land pooling by exercising eminent domain power, and then using that to sort of develop range of financing options, some through public or access to public funds, and others through a combination of public and funds by negotiations with developers. Those may be possible, but as long as the groups have the ability to engage in that form of negotiation and they can pull it off, that it won't be a lopsided relationship. It's possible to do. But in a situation like Malaysia, for example, where we went, the communities have been cut off from having any relationship with actors other than the city hall. The city hall has said you cannot negotiate separately if private developers come to you. There is no other negotiation strategy that's possible. And that's, you can say, well, what still prevents the community from just ignoring the state and just negotiating on their own? Well, the reality is that Malaysia is also under martial law, mostly. Kuala Lumpur has been under a state of emergency for the last 30 years. Since the riots took place in '60, they never lifted the emergency, and it's been very useful for urban planning, as you can imagine. Under a state of emergency, you can be arrested if you protest. There is no procedural rights that come to you, okay? And you can be hauled off to jail, and the courts are not going to intervene because the whole process is actually carried out under special laws. And that's actually one of the key sort of instruments for Malaysia's own urban transformation under extreme repression.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask a question about, you raised a lot of interesting questions about how the right to the city might have sort of possibilities as well as pitfalls, and you talked a little bit about your anxiety about legalization. I'm thinking about other dynamics in cities in India, for example, where once you move past the question of slum demolition, or you're talking really about the displacement of people to urban peripheries, and the right to the city may not so much be about the right to occupancy per se, but say the right to informal economies and illegal economic activity and so on. I'm just wondering about how the right to the city, as it's being globally articulated, thinks about things like informal economies in urban sectors, because those have been longstanding routes of surviving and so on. I'm also interested in the issue of mobility. In what ways does the global kind of conversation about the right to the city conceptualize or think about not only transnational migration, but rural to urban migration? Like, how does it impact the frameworks that people are developing around this? Or is it even a question, or what kinds of problems does it throw up?
Yeah. In India, at least, as you probably know, you know that the right to the city is not a highly relevant idea to the extent that movements and activists and NGOs are mobilizing. It's still around constitutional rights, which have to still do with, at the most, right to adequate housing. That itself is not explicitly recognized, but through judicial rulings, it's been found over the years. The strategies of those who live in the, I don't know what to call them, informal economy, because so much of so-called formal housing is informal anyway. In fact, if you look closely, much of Delhi's urban construction, for example, so-called middle-class neighborhoods, are all in violation of housing codes and planning regulations. They've just not been demolished because of the power they have for getting away with their violation of rules. So I kind of don't know if formal, informal is a useful dichotomy in a country like India where 90% is informal in that way. But the strategies, I think your core question was, if you're not getting kicked out of your land, then if you want to stay put, what's a strategy around achieving that goal, whether right to the city could be useful in that way. And my own sense, so at least at this stage, is that right to the city as a spatial claim is actually less effective because it doesn't have the resonance politically that it did in Brazil, for example, or in Mexico City. Because urban groups, urban NGOs, urban social movements are actually quite rare. They're mostly issue-based, housing NGOs. And so and this is a fundamental difference between the way in which NGOs operate in a city like Delhi or Mumbai versus in Sao Paulo. Or Mexico City, you have city-wide, or increasingly in other Asian cities like Jakarta, you find groups that are focused on cities. There are some exceptions to this, like there was a group called Transparent Chennai, which was actually focused on urban problems of this spatial thing called Chennai as a city, and what do you do about that? And within that, dealing with the question of, do you kick out those, people without titles and who live in what you call informal settlements or slums? What do you do about the livelihood strategies of the very poor, including those who are in the informal markets? What do you do about sanitation and water provisioning strategy for those who lack access to toilets? Those broad issues were actually being considered for city as a whole, but these are there are very few. These are exceptions to the rule, and I do think that the language of right to the city plays out very differently in different parts of the world. And thus far, it's actually had a lot more resonance in the Latin American context, and to a lesser extent in Europe and North America, rather than in Asia and certainly in Africa. On the question of migration, I'm not sure I have an answer. It's a very large question, and I'm not sure whether right to the city as a notion can actually, in some ways, deal with the complexities of urban-rural migration issues. Although the one thing I would say is that increasingly in urban theory, there is more of a raising of questions about what exactly is the way in which we theorize about the word urban, and how is that connected to what is left out in terms of whatever you call it, rural or, whatever is the other of urban, and what the structural connections between these two spatial zones might themselves be, and whether our theoretical ideas, including potentially emancipatory ideas like right to the city, are capable of kind of capturing the power dynamics that are embedded in these types of relations. That's really the open question. I'm thinking of the work of somebody like Neil Brenner at Harvard School of Design, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. A couple of additional thank yous. If you RSVP'd, we will spam you with further events. We have some very interesting ones coming up this fall. A couple of thank yous, Jen Burge and her staff, who make the theater work so well. Becky Amato, Jason Lanning from the Urban Democracy Lab. Victor Bautista, who's going to cut out all the bad things I said. And then Vasu Kinesia, the Human Rights Initiative. And thanks to you for your wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.